Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah wahda wa salatu wa salamu ala man la nabiyya ba'dahu wa ba'd. I was hoping this session would be more interactive rather than just me dictating to you as a lecturer in some university hall. So the question is, as per the poster, Fiqh or Hadith? Now, my first question to you is this a valid question, even to pose, to begin with? Why do you think this question arose? Or why do you think this question is in the minds of some? Any clues? Anything? There's no wrong answers here.
People these days quote Hadith without looking at what the jurists have said about this Hadith and the topic.
Yeah, just to repeat what he said, because people watching online wouldn't have heard. So people quote Hadith because?
They quote Hadith because that's what they say in the books, because the books are readily available.
Yeah, so the Hadith books are now readily available, so therefore we can discard some opinions in fiqh for Hadith. Yeah, that's one reason, okay. Any other reasons?
Misunderstanding of what fiqh is in reality.
Misunderstanding of what fiqh is. So we go with Hadith because fiqh, because of a shallow understanding of how fiqh and Hadith works. So we'll just go with what the Prophet ﷺ said. We can disregard what the jurists, what the fuqaha said. That's another reason. Any other reasons? So in both reasons given, and there are others, always the preference for such shallow questions is given to Hadith, because supposedly the Prophet ﷺ is on the side of Hadith, or that's the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ, the actions of the Prophet ﷺ, whereas fiqh is the work of some jurist who came 100 or 200 years after the Prophet, who may or may not have been aware of XYZ Hadith. So the tendency is to side with Hadith at the expense of what the jurists said. Now, are these concerns, and these are concerns, legitimate concerns, are these concerns, do they hold any legitimacy, actual weight, that we should go along with what the Prophet ﷺ said all times, and we can disregard fiqh? We can disregard what the jurists said. So you can look at it both ways. So in one sense, it is a valid concern. So a jurist may legitimately not have come across a hadith which a later jurist or another jurist or another school would have come across. And in that situation, there is some validity to siding with the hadith and not siding with what X jurist said about XYZ matter. Okay? But there's another consideration. What if, for example, the jurist was aware of that hadith and didn't adopt it? Now, give me some reasons why a jurist would actually be aware of the hadith but does not side with the apparent meaning of that hadith. Which considerations are at play here?
Could have been abrogated.
So that's one consideration. In the view of that jurist, the hadith is abrogated. It's superseded by another hadith, by another statement or action of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, abrogation doesn't simply mean the Prophet ﷺ early on in his prophetic career said, don't do this, and later on in his prophetic career said, do it. Abrogation can be deduced. It can be more subtle. So the Prophet ﷺ, for example, explicitly said not to do something early on in his prophetic life, and later on he actually did it. So that's a sign that the earlier provision is abrogated. Any other ways of abrogation that is used by the jurists? So for example, the Prophet ﷺ said or did something, and then according to this jurist, there's a Quranic provision that seemingly indicates, so it doesn't necessarily even have to be from the Prophet. It can be a Quranic provision, a Quranic verse, that seemingly goes against what the Prophet ﷺ did early on in his life. Now, for this discipline within fiqh, one needs to know when provisions are revealed, when action or hadith is said or done by the Prophet ﷺ. One, as a jurist, needs to be aware of the dates of which came before and which came earlier. So obviously the previous provision would be considered abrogated, and the later provision would be considered the abrogator. Okay? So that is one consideration in the mind of the jurists as to why he would abandon a hadith. Are there any other considerations why a jurist would abandon a hadith? Context. So basically, the Prophet ﷺ said something or did something in a particular context is not universally applicable. It's not universally applicable. Now, without that context, the hadith might seem universal. And many a time within the books of hadith, you have a short version of the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said something, but then in that same hadith book or in another hadith book, or even in in a book of history, you find the whole story, the context behind that hadith, the background behind that hadith. Now, that story, that background, that context, which gives you a whole picture of that hadith, would inform you that this hadith is applicable only to X, Y, Z situation. It's not universally applicable. And context is one of the most important factors within the toolbox of a mujtahid, of a jurist. And without context, many a time, there can be misunderstandings of hadith, there can be misunderstandings of the Quranic verses, and many deviances or many sects that became deviant was because of their misunderstanding of hadith, of Quran, due to taking them out of context. Like, for example, the Khawarij and the verse in al-hukmu illa lillah. The Kharijites, a deviant sect that appeared in the time of the Sahaba with their roots. Even in the time of Prophet ﷺ, there were some people with that mentality. Like a person said to the Prophet ﷺ, "I'dil ya Muhammad fa innaka lam ta'dil." Be just, O Muhammad, because you haven't done justice. You can have extreme interpretations even in the time of Prophet ﷺ. And obviously this mentality grew in the time of the Sahaba, and then obviously after that Ali radiallahu anhu had a major problem with the Khawarij, and they became a fully fledged sect after that, and it only took a few decades before they died out due to the extreme interpretations of the Quran and Sunnah. They survived for quite a bit actually. Any other considerations why a jurist would abandon the apparent meaning of a hadith or even a Quranic verse?
There could be other hadith in the matter as well, so they'd have to look at all of them.
Yeah, so there's a hadith that contradicts it. Now, this isn't the same as the first. The first is, or the jurist knows for sure that X hadith came earlier, Y hadith came later. The Y hadith would abrogate the X hadith. If there's a contradiction, that means you genuinely don't know, or the jurist genuinely does not know which came earlier, which came later. So in that situation, a jurist would have other tools, or would take into consideration other tools at his disposal in order to ascertain which hadith is to be taken, which hadith is to be discarded. Okay? Now, one might question, the law of Allah shouldn't contradict itself. So how can we so easily say hadiths are contradicting one another, Quranic verses are contradicting one another, Quran and hadith are contradicting one another? How would you respond to that accusation or allegation?
Because the contradiction itself is just an apparent contradiction. There was an explanation. Did you say?
It's just an apparent contradiction. So there's not a contradiction in reality.
Maybe the ruling changed later on in the Sharia.
Sorry?
Maybe later on in the Sharia the ruling changed. For example, at the graveyards, before they can go and now they can go.
But that's an example of a clear-cut abrogation.
Mm.
Can you give an example on ayah and hadith?
So, for example, you have the issue of eating cats and dogs. The Malikis allow it. So they're the most liberal madhab in terms of dietary law. So they say the verse, not just cats and dogs, but they say the verse of Surah Al-An'am. قل لا أجد فيما أوحي إلي محرما على طاعم يطعمه إلا أن يكون ميتة, except when it's a carrion, died by itself, أو دما مسفوحا, or flowing blood, أو لحم خنزير, or the flesh of swine, فإنه رجس, أو فسقا أهل لغير الله به, or any other animal that's been slaughtered in the name of other than Allah's. Those four are haram. This verse is saying. This verse came very late on in the prophetic career, which according to the Malikis seems to suggest that all other provisions that came before it, prohibiting X animal, Y animal, Z animal, they're all abrogated. So all those prohibitions have been superseded by this verse, because this verse came very late on in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. It's one of the last verses. But the other jurists say no, that this verse is not universal. This verse has a particular context. It's not referring to the universal body of dietary law. So you have a difference of opinion amongst the jurists with regards to all these categories of animals, because of the different understandings of how these verses and hadith are to be interpreted. Is there a genuine contradiction between this verse and the other hadith which prohibit these animals? Or is there which according to the Malikis there is. According to the Malikis, there is a contradiction between this verse that prohibits only these four and allows everything else, and the other hadith which prohibit animals. So because according to them this is a contradiction, and because according to the Malikis they understand this verse to have come or to have been revealed very later on in the time of Prophet ﷺ, they consider this verse to be a nasikh, an abrogator of all the ahadith that prohibit these animals. They consider this verse to be an abrogator, and they consider the ahadith that prohibit the flesh of all these animals to be abrogated. Whereas according to the other schools, there's no contradiction between the two, and this verse has a particular context to it.
Can I ask, are you allowing Q&A as you go?
Yeah.
If anyone wants to ask a question, raise your hand and ask, inshallah,
Yeah.
No one can see your faces anyway.
So
from a non-Muslim point of view, because I'm dealing
yeah.
with it, we don't say contradiction, we don't concede that. We just say that this, everything, like I said, has a context, interpretation.
Yeah.
All religions, all jurisprudence has that. There is no contradiction. Whereas we all agree as Muslims, our Aqidah is from Allah.
Yeah.
As Christians, they try it. Whereas your Aqidah is messed up from the beginning. So, try to say.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
According to the other schools, there's no contradiction between the two, and they assign an interpretation to this verse, and they keep the hadith that prohibit the flesh of these animals as is. But there is seemingly a contradiction between the two, which is why the jurists differ over this issue. Okay? So seemingly there is a contradiction. What we say with regards to the general issue of contradictions in the Sharia is that when it comes to the primary provisions that are clear-cut upon which beliefs and the fundamentals of Islam are based, there is no contradiction at all. When it comes to the lower level or the lower tier provisions, legal rulings, etc., within the Sharia, one as a jurist might be able to uncover what might appear to be a contradiction. Okay? That is how the Sharia is designed. When it comes to issues that are clear-cut, matters pertaining to belief and disbelief, matters pertaining to the fundamentals of Islam, matters pertaining to salvation, Allah makes those provisions clear-cut. The Prophet ﷺ makes those provisions clear-cut. When it comes to issues pertaining to subsidiaries, or in Arabic you say dhanniyat, things that are speculative, things that upon which salvation is not predicated, things upon which things that are not pertaining to faith and disbelief. In these things, obviously there is one answer in the eyes of Allah, but that might remain obscure, and as a result jurists can differ with one another. And this idea of jurists differing with one another is something that is allowed, tolerated by the Sharia. It's not something that's been left to chance. There's explicit allowance for difference of opinion in legal subsidiaries, or in any subsidiary for that matter, because you can even have theological subsidiaries where theologians can disagree with one another over lower tier provisions. So for example, when it comes to the Sharia explicitly allowing these type of things, a difference of opinion, this famous story in the time of Prophet ﷺ, where the Prophet ﷺ told a group of companions after the tribe of Qurayza, the Banu Qurayza, had demonstrated their treachery against the Muslims when they were not supposed to commit treachery during the Battle of the Trench, or the Battle of the Confederates. Ghazwatul Khandaq, Ghazwatul Ahzab, same thing. So once that treachery had become clear, after the war, the Prophet ﷺ told a group of Sahaba, go to Banu Qurayza and do not stop to read Salah until you reach Banu Qurayza. There's a difference in narrations as to whether this Salah was Dhuhr and Asr, but the content is the same. Do not stop until you get to أَلَا لَا يُصَلِّيَنَّ أَحَدَكُمُ الظُّهْرَ إِلَّا فِي بَنِي قُرَيْظَةَ. Or in another narration, أَلَا لَا يُصَلِّيَنَّ أَحَدَكُمُ الْعَصْرَ إِلَّا فِي بَنِي قُرَيْظَةَ. Don't read Dhuhr or don't read Asr until you get to Banu Qurayza. So this delegation or this group of Sahaba started going to Banu Qurayza on the outskirts of Medina, the then Medina. And on the way, the time of Salah had almost expired, and in one narration, it had expired, or it was about to expire. So these Sahaba differed amongst one another. Should we read Dhuhr or Asr now, or should we wait until we get to Banu Qurayza? And they differed. And obviously the Prophet ﷺ is in central Medina. There's no way to consult the Prophet ﷺ without going back, which would be time wasting. And obviously the explicit command of the Prophet ﷺ was to get to Banu Qurayza before they flee or do whatever. So one group of Sahaba read the Salah immediately on their way, and the other group of Sahaba read it once they reached. And in one narration, the time of Salah had expired, and then they read Salah. So this news of this was relayed to the Prophet ﷺ when they could. And what did the Prophet ﷺ do? Or what did he say? He said nothing. He just smiled. Which is a tacit approval on his part that you can have a provision within the Sharia. In this instance is an explicit command of the Prophet. أَلَا لَا يُصَلِّيَنَّ أَحَدُكُمْ الظُّهْرَ أَوْ الْعَصْرَ إِلَّا فِي بَنِي قُرَيْظَةَ. You can have different interpretations of a single hadith, even in the lifetime of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this hadith, even though it's to do with warfare and jihad and etc. This hadith is the explicit precedent for the allowance of difference of interpretation amongst jurists, amongst Muslim jurists. Okay?
Does that mean both were accepted, the fact that they then read Salah after it expired?
So now this becomes a matter of theology. Are both correct in the eyes of Allah? Is just one of them correct in the eyes of Allah? So that's a matter of theology. This theological matter is from the subsidiaries of theology. It doesn't have any major impact. Are both correct in the eyes of Allah, or is only one of them correct in the eyes of Allah, whereas the other would be forgiven for their error in their ijtihad, in their juristic reasoning? Okay? Now, just for those who have studied, many a time this opinion that both are correct in the eyes of Allah is associated with the Mu'tazilites. But in reality, a lot of Sunni scholars have also adopted this view that you can have, that both opinions, contradictory opinions, are correct in the eyes of Allah. So Suyuti, Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, quite a lot of Ash'ari scholars have said, Shafi'i Ash'ari scholars have said that the view that both are correct in the eyes of Allah, that is the correct view. That when jurists differ, both of them are correct in the eyes of Allah. The other view says one of them is correct in the eyes of Allah and the other is not, but they would both be rewarded for their juristic reasoning. So it's not an exclusively Mu'tazilite position that tasweeb in Arabic, you say that you consider both to be correct. It's not an exclusively Mu'tazilite position. Sorry, someone was asking something.
Yeah, I was just saying, maybe I'm confused. So is it? I don't know if it's a hadith or it's an author that the one who does it right gets one reward and the other gets like two. Is that something else, or am I confusing? So many scholars have linked that hadith. إذا اجتهد الحاكم فأصاب فله أجران. He would get 2 rewards if he's right. وإن أخطأ فله أجر واحد. If he errs, then he'll get 1 reward. Many scholars have linked the issue of juristic difference to that hadith. So a jurist who gets it right will get 1 reward. 2 rewards, and a jurist who doesn't get it right but still take the effort out to formulate a position, he will get 1 reward. Obviously, this is in relation to the subsidiaries. This hadith is not in relation to matters of the fundamentals. So there's no issue of 2 rewards and 1 rewards over there. Over there, you have to get it right. Now, if someone in the fundamentals, by the way, gets something wrong, genuinely wrong, they would not be rewarded, but they will be excused. Okay? They will be excused. So, for example, there were many, just to give you an example, there were many Basran scholars who disbelieved in destiny. Qadr. وَالْقَدْرِ خَيْرِهِ وَشَرِّهِ مِنَ اللَّهِ. Like many hadith scholars, many hadith narrators, like Qatada, a famous narrator within the hadith corpus is Qatada ibn Di'ama as-Sadusi. And other Basran scholars, this opinion of the denial of destiny was a position of many Basran scholars. And obviously we know it's one of the fundamentals of faith, one of the fundamental articles of faith. Amantu billahi wa malaikatihi wa kutubihi wa rusulihi wal yawmil akhiri wal qadri khayrihi wa sharrihi min Allah. That destiny, good and bad, is from Allah. But they denied it. Not in the sense that they denied wal qadri khayrihi wa sharrihi min Allah, but they reinterpreted it in a manner which nowadays would be considered unacceptable. Okay? We don't say that they are rewarded for this position they held. Now, because of the environment they were living in, Basra, which was a region that was heavily influenced by Mu'tazilites who also denied Qadr. We say, okay, this is from the fundamentals. They would not be rewarded for their ijtihad. Their ijtihad is completely wrong, and we completely disagree with it. We condemn it. But for them, we can say they were ma'dhur, they're excused for whatever reason. Okay. And there's many practices that occurred across Islamic history where people en masse got it completely wrong.
Sheikh, what was the interpretation of that out of interest? The Western scholars, what did they say regarding taqdir?
So generally they say that this is linked to the issue of man's actions, because they say if it's destiny, if we believe in destiny, then they say everything's predetermined. That means we don't have any free will. So they couldn't reconcile between destiny and free will. Whereas majority of the scholars of the Ummah say there is a way to reconcile between destiny, everything being predetermined by Allah, and the fact that we have free choice in order to carry out our own actions. So that's the rationale for them denying destiny.
Isn't that more of a Jabariya position?
Yeah. So they say qadr leads to jabr.
Yeah.
The belief in qadr, destiny, leads to jabr. Jabr means determinism in English, I think. Yeah, Jabariya, determinists. Determinists means everything's been determined. We have no free will of our own. We're just like stones and sticks being thrown around. Okay? So we've gone way off on a tangent. So yeah. So just to bring the issue back to the reasons why jurists would go against the apparent content of Quranic verses or Hadith. So we've discussed abrogation. We've discussed genuine contradiction, in which we don't know if there's an abrogation or there's some other reason. We've discussed, there was a third reason we discussed as well, which was context. And there's also another interpretation. There's also another reason which we've touched upon lightly. Basically, a difference of interpretation of a hadith. Difference of interpretation within a hadith. So now you can appreciate why jurists differ with one another over specifics within a hadith. So now you can see how subjectivity, interpretation, regional difference, which I'll come on in a minute, understandings of how abrogation works, all these things come into play, which these are all factors which are well beyond considerations whether a hadith is authentic or not. Because the job of a muhaddith is to ascertain. The job of a muhaddith doesn't go much beyond considerations of whether a hadith is authentic or weak or fabricated or etc. The job of a jurist, a genuine mujtahid jurist, is to not only consider whether the hadith is authentic or not, but whether it's clear cut or not. Is it unambiguous or is it ambiguous? That's the first consideration. Another consideration, even if it's unambiguous, is it abrogated or not? It might be even though it might be clear cut, it might be abrogated. So how can you use that hadith? Another consideration is this hadith universal or not? It might have a specific, it might be contextualized, it might not be universal. So there's many other factors far beyond considerations of whether a hadith is authentic or not that are within the consideration of a mujtahid, faqih, jurist. And then there's further considerations that are beyond the simple exercise of ijtihad. I say simple relative to what I'm about to say now. Ijtihad is not a simple exercise. Ijtihad is a very high level of scholarship. When you're passing fatwa, you as a mujtahid or a faqih may have formulated your own view on X matter. Okay? That something is haram or something is allowed. Something is wajib or something is mustahab. Or you have to take X course of action or Y course of action. But when you're passing fatwa, there's another consideration at play. The situation of a mustafti, the situation of a person who comes to you with a question. Your opinion might not be suitable for the mustafti. Your opinion might be completely impractical for the mustafti, for the person who's come to you with a question. You as a mufti, and there's a mustafti in front of you, your opinion, which you have arrived at through your own personal ijtihad, might be completely unsuitable, impractical, unwise for the mustafti to act upon. So what would a mujtahid do in that situation? Or a faqih, a mufti, do in that situation?
Looking to opinion of other madhab, no?
Yeah, so either they would pass fatwa according to another opinion, which might not even be their own opinion, or they would simply refer the mustafti to another scholar. So this requires the ability to analyze the situation of the person who comes to you with a question. So now you can see the huge complexity that comes in this whole matter. That what one fatwa might be suitable for one person might not be suitable for another. And there's many instances of this within the earliest jurists of Islam, referring mustaftis to another scholar, or simply issuing fatwa according to an opinion which is not even their own. Okay? So it's not, when it comes to fiqh, it's not simply a matter of this hadith is authentic, we must act upon it and impose it upon everyone. No. It's a case of considering the Quran and Hadith provisions that are in front of you, considering the different situations in which the Quranic hadith, the Quranic verses and the hadith of Prophet ﷺ have been revealed in, or have been said in, or have been done in. And in the context of fatwa, in the context of passing fatwa, considerations of what state a mustafti is in. Okay? So, fiqh or hadith? What's your answer for that? We'll come back to the title of this topic. In one way, it is a valid question, but in more ways than one, it's an invalid. It's not a legitimate question to begin with. It's a valid question in the sense that, okay, if a mujtahid genuinely missed out on a hadith, who didn't reach him, or completely misinterpreted it, then okay, yes, there's a case to correct, or there's a case to move away from that scholar's opinion. But many a time, in most cases, there are other considerations at play, not just the hadith, not just the authenticity or weakness of the hadith. Now, I just want to go back to a small issue, which is how Islam developed in the time of the Prophet and immediately after in the time of the Sahaba. Did the Prophet ﷺ come to teach hadith and fiqh as subjects? Was he teaching hadith as a subject? Was he teaching fiqh as a subject? Was he teaching Quran as a subject? No, he wasn't. He was teaching deen. He was teaching Islam. He was teaching the fundamentals of the faith. Okay? He was teaching deen. He wasn't teaching the subjects in a siloed, disaggregated manner. Okay? Which is why many a time, even in the answers of the Prophet ﷺ given to Sahaba, different Sahaba would come, what is the best of a'mal? What is the best of actions? His answer would differ based on the Sahabi who was asking him the question. Ayyul a'mali afdal. If you Google search Ayyul a'mali afdal within Shamil or Google, you'll find different answers given by the Prophet ﷺ to different companions. Why was this? He would answer based on the state of the mustafti, the Sahabi who was asking him the question. Okay?
What was the term?
Which action is the best? Ayyul a'mali afdal. Yeah. So even when it came to important matters like jihad, and most of the time before, especially before Ahzab, most of the time jihad was defensive in the time of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Even in that situation, if a Sahabi came up to him and his parents were alive and they needed someone in the house to take care of them, even in that situation, he would disallow that Sahabi from participating in battle. He said, look after your parents. Look after your parents. You don't need to come to jihad. The Prophet ﷺ came to teach us deen, not hadith. He came as to teach us Islam, not fiqh or tafsir as subjects, okay? Now, obviously, after the Prophet ﷺ, things started to become disaggregated due to the nature of the subjects that we have in front of us nowadays. So you have the hadith tradition developing, you had the fiqh tradition developing, you had the qira'at tradition developing, and subjects proliferated as time went on. Later on, you had the ulum al-Quran, then you had the usul al-fiqh tradition developing. You had later on, obviously the different madhab developing of fiqh. You had the aqidah traditions developing, the various aqaid strands. In the time of Umar radiallahu anh, he sent a particular Sahabi to Iraq to teach them about Islam. Which Sahabi was this? Abdullah bin Mas'ud, the famous Abdullah bin Mas'ud. Now Abdullah bin Mas'ud had been with the Prophet ﷺ right from the beginning, from the early Meccan period. He was one of the early Sahaba to accept Islam. Abdullah bin Mas'ud was sent to Iraq to teach the Muslims there. And Umar said about him that to the people of Iraq, I have preferred you over myself with regards to Abdullah bin Mas'ud. Meaning I needed Abdullah bin Mas'ud's expertise right here in Medina. However, still, I am going to send you the best of us, Abdullah bin Mas'ud, to teach you about Islam. Abdullah bin Mas'ud taught the Muslims in Kufa, and he produced the most strongest, able, learned cohort of Ashabul Ashab, meaning Tabi'un. His students are the most able compared to any other Sahabi. So his students like Masruq, Aswad, Alqamah, all these students, when you compare them to the main students of other Sahaba, his students are the most prominent amongst the Tabi'un in terms of knowledge. He produced the most able and capable cohort of fuqaha, you can say. Now, think about this. Even though Abdullah bin Mas'ud was extremely knowledgeable, he was extremely knowledgeable. He was right there with the Prophet ﷺ right from the beginning. He participated in the Battle of Badr. Even he didn't have access to the entire corpus of hadith. He didn't have access to the entire corpus of hadith, which is why a fair amount of Abdullah bin Mas'ud's opinions are discarded by the later Iraqi scholars, who are Abdullah bin Mas'ud is their ultimate teacher. A fair amount of his opinions are discarded by his students and obviously the Iraqi tradition of fiqh, which eventually culminated within the Hanafi school, which was based out of Iraq. If you were a student of Abdullah bin Mas'ud, studying under Abdullah bin Mas'ud directly, would you have gone out of your way to locate other hadith which might not have been within the knowledge of Abdullah bin Mas'ud? Was this ever a consideration of the students of Abdullah bin Mas'ud that we need to find out, okay, we've taken all the hadith from Abdullah bin Mas'ud that are available, but possibly he might have missed a few hadith here and there. Let's go to Madinah and Makkah and find out which hadith he missed out on. Was this ever a going concern? Was this a consideration of the students of Abdullah bin Mas'ud? Is there any record of this happening? No. This was never a going concern. This was never a pressing consideration of the students of Abdullah bin Mas'ud. And this is replicated across the body of the students of the Prophet ﷺ. So the students of the Prophet ﷺ are the Sahaba, and their students are the Tabi'un. So in that immediate first generation after the time of the Sahaba, Hadith would be imparted to the Tabi'un, the students of the Sahaba. But the idea that they needed to do rihla, they needed to travel, they needed to commit to long journeys to ensure that they had the entire corpus of ahadith in front of them in order to formulate positions, this was not a consideration. This was not a consideration. And this kick-started the trend of regional fiqh. So before the madhahib that we have in front of us nowadays, the Hanafi school, the Malikis, the Shafis, the Hanbalis, and also the other schools that developed back then, the Awza'i school, the Makhul school, the Sufyan al-Thawri school, the Dawud al-Zahiri school. Before these schools developed, the eponymous schools that are named after a particular scholar, like Abu Hanifa, the Hanafi school, the Maliki school, Malik, Shafi'i school, Shafi'i, Hanbali school, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the Sufyan al-Thawri school, the Sufyani madhab, okay, etc. Before these schools, the schools were regional. So you had the Madani school, or you had the Hijazi school in general, of which there's Makkah and Makki school and Madani school. You had the Iraqi school. And then you had, to an extent, the Shami school and the Misri school. But the main regional schools were the Hijazi school and the Iraqi school. If you look at how the Hijazi schools and the Iraqi schools developed in terms of their fiqh, apart from the odd interaction here and there, and apart from the fact that the Iraqi scholars would have inevitably gone for Hajj, there wasn't a concerted effort on the part of either school to travel to the other region and to acquire the ahadith that were present in the other region. You can still legitimately say nowadays that, and it is a fact, that the Iraqi scholars didn't have access to the hadith corpus that was present in the Hijaz. A lot of the ahadith that were in circulation within the Hijaz, they didn't reach Iraq. Certainly not, definitely not en masse. And likewise, to a lesser extent, the Hijazi scholars didn't have access to the odd few ahadith that went through Abdullah bin Mas'ud and other companions who went to Iraq, like Ali ibn Abi Talib, etc. The Hijazi scholars wouldn't have had access to those ahadith. And those schools developed in parallel to one another. So the idea that, just before I get on to that point, when did this effort start of gathering ahadith all together and taking them all into consideration? With whom did this start with, this trend? Not even Imam Malik. Imam Malik was based out of Madinah. He went to Hajj once. He never went to Iraq. So who did this start with, the project of gathering ahadith from different regions? Imam?
It was from the Sihha Sitta Imams.
No, before that. Just Imam Malik's student, Imam al-Shafi. In his initial stages, he was based out in Makkah. And he studied with his teacher, Muslim bin Khalid, but others as well. He studied with Imam Malik in Madinah for a good few years, until Imam Malik died. Then he moved to Iraq. Imam Shafi had his own mihna like Imam Ahmad, but that's a different point. But he moved to Iraq. And when he was in Iraq, he met his junior Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Now Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal was already a made-over muhaddith. He is the biggest muhaddith of the four imams, no doubt. Imam Shafi, as his senior, went to Imam Ahmad, his junior, and he said, if you are aware of any hadith that I am not aware of from my training in Makkah and Medina, then please let me know. And his specific words were, Kufiyan kana aw Basriyan aw Shamiyan, to that effect. If there's any hadith which is Basran, with the scholars of Basra, or with Basran chains of hadith, or Kufan chains of hadith, any hadith that's present in Kufa which other regions are not aware of, or Shami, Syrian, then let me know. He didn't say or Makkiyan or Madaniyan. Why? He's already studied that. So there's a meaning to this to this statement of Shafi, that if there's any tradition that I'm unaware of, whether it's Basran, whether it's Kufan, whether it's Syrian, let me know so I can incorporate it in my into my fiqh, essentially, because they were studying hadith to incorporate it into their fiqh. He was a mujtahid and a muhaddith. The project of gathering hadith from different regions in earnest started with Imam al-Shafi'i. And in the time of Imam al-Shafi'i, there was still no Hanafi madhab. There was still no Maliki madhab. In the time of Shafi'i, it was still the madhab, when it comes to fiqh, it was still the madhab of Madinah. It was still the madhab of Iraq. There was no Hanafi madhab. Hanafi madhab developed after Imam Hanifa passed away through the works of his student Muhammad al-Hasan and his subsequent students. And likewise, the Maliki school, as a name, Maliki school, before that it was the Madani school or the Hijazi school. The Maliki school only developed after his students dispersed across the lands. Some went to Andalusia, some went to Iraq, some showed up in Egypt. That's when the Maliki school, that's when the Madani school really morphed into the Maliki school. Likewise, when the Iraqi school morphed into the Hanafi school. It happened after Imam Abu Hanifa had passed away. It happened after Imam Malik died. It was Imam al-Shafi'i who kick-started the project of hadith gathering, hadith collection, and regardless of region. So fiqh became, after Imam al-Shafi'i, it became region agnostic. Before that, it was region-based. Okay? And then obviously after Imam al-Shafi'i and Imam Ahmad, the whole project of rihla started, of the muhaddithun. Rihla means travel. So this is where you see Bukhari and Muslim traveling far lands across the then Islamic state, gathering ahadith from different regions and incorporating it into their hadith works, which we see nowadays. So, but before that, it wasn't like that. Before that, it was simply not like that. So you can easily see in the pre-Rihla era, in the pre-Hadith gathering era, the regions of fiqh developed in relative isolation from one another. And you can appreciate that the tradition of Iraq, because it's in relative isolation to Hijaz, it would have developed in a manner that would have here and there missed out on X hadith, Y hadith, Z hadith in matters pertaining to specific matters pertaining to ibadat, or acts of worship, or specific matters pertaining to muamalat, acts of commerce or family law, or whatever. You can't have expected them to have covered 100% of the ahadith corpus. It's simply the subjects simply did not develop that in that manner, especially in the era of regional fiqh. Now, after Imam al-Shafi'i and his project, and then after Imam Ahmad, who had even more hadith in his arsenal, and after the era of Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim, when the era of Rihla started in earnest, regional fiqh came under scrutiny, because they would have missed out on certain ahadith, almost, or even if they were aware of a hadith, they would have missed out on how to interpret certain hadith in line with the mainstream, whereas in Iraq, they would have only interpreted it in a manner which was not mainstream. Okay? So this is how, especially the Hanafi madhab, but also to a lesser extent the Maliki madhab, this is how the Hanafi madhab had fallen under the scrutiny of the Ahlul Hadith, the traditional Ahlul Hadith, the Muhaddithun, the Hadith scholars, and also the Shafis and the Hanbalis. Because the Shafis and the Hanbalis, their fiqh is very much hadith oriented and not necessarily region oriented. Okay, so you can see where this dichotomy between fiqh and hadith came about. Now, what would have been the correct response of the Hanafi school to this whole phenomenon of hadith development?
They learned from Ibn Masud, the Sahaba.
Sorry?
They learned from Ibn Masud, the Sahabi. Direct chain.
Yeah, but then they would have still inevitably missed out on certain ahadith.
To reflect all of the hadith from other regions as well, and incorporate.
Yeah, but if you incorporate it, then you're going to change the structure of the Hanafi school in many opinions, and that never really happened.
So you're asking what ideally should have happened?
Yeah, what ideally, what should the Hanafi madhab, should it have gone through a transformation of incorporating a hadith which it missed out on, or should it have taken another course of action?
You're saying maybe they could have done what Imam Shafi'i did, send out the scholars, so when they learned from Ibn Masud, spread out different regions.
Okay, we can say for sure that never happened to the Hanafi school.
Can I ask a quick question before that?
Yeah.
You know, you said Imam Shafi'i, he started the travelling for knowledge and for hadith.
Yeah, even his travel was limited, but
Sahaba never did that at all.
they didn't travel for hadith.
Oh, for knowledge.
Yeah, there's instances here and there, but on a concerted.
Technical hadith knowledge.
Yeah.
For knowledge.
On a concerted
Right.
level, specifically traveling from city to city to city, like Bukhari did, or the scholars of hadith did. That never happened. For Imam Shafi'i, he was still very much contained in his era. So he was in Makkah and Madinah, but then he was in Iraq. So he had the expertise of Imam Ahmad in front of him. So he gathered a lot of hadith from others as well in Iraq, and then he eventually settled in Egypt, and that's where he died. So Rihla to a small, the project of gathering a hadith started at a smaller level by Imam Shafi, but Imam Ahmad and onwards, the project of Rihla really started from him, from them. Okay. So what should have happened to the Hanafi school? Should it have gone through the process of, okay, we have these ahadith in front of us which weren't in our consideration previously, or by our imams, or by the students of the imams, we should incorporate those ahadith into our fiqh? Or should they have doubled down, which they did double down?
Not sticking to one region, because the more you branch out, a lot of opinions and subjectivity that you can't agree for because you don't know them. So just sticking to one region is stick to the needs of that region. So like per region.
So after Imam Shafi, everything became amalgamated with one another. The region died out. Regional understanding of religion and fiqh died out, and it was really, okay, do you have the hadith or not, regardless of which region it comes from. So there was no longer, after Imam Shafi, pretty much died out the tradition of regional fiqh. Okay, to answer, there's no right or wrong answer as to what should have happened to the Hanafi madhab. You could have gone down the path of, okay, let's incorporate the ahadith. Or the other path which it did go down is to double down and start reinterpreting all these new ahadith that are coming that seemingly go against the Hanafi school. Okay? And then also, there's other considerations at play which I don't want to go into. There was a lot of animosity between the Ahlul Hadith and the Hanafi school. Why?
Did the Ahlul Hadith accuse them of being Ahlul Ra'i? Is that true?
Yeah, they were accused of being Ahlul Ra'i, meaning depending a lot on Ra'i as opposed to Hadith. Ra'i means juristic opinion. There's a lot of, if you look at Imam Abu Hanifa's student, Imam Muhammad, his works, he talks a lot about Ara'ayta, what if this happens, what if that happens, what if this happens, what if that happens, what's the hukm? So there's not a lot of hadith. His books are not hadith oriented. There's hadith mentioned here and there, but it's not hadith oriented like the books of like Shafi and Ahmad, and especially the later muhaddithun. What was I saying just before this?
Animosity.
Yeah, animosity. What are the reasons for animosity between the Hanafis and the Ahlul Hadith?
What's the regional differences as well, cultural differences? Did that creep in?
So that was already there. The Iraqi, there was already a low-level animosity between the Hijazis and the Iraqis. So Imam Malik would never take any hadith from Iraq. He didn't trust the hadith of Iraq at all. There was already that low-level animosity, but the animosity in earnest really started after Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Abu Isa Muhammad, the Hanafi Imams passed away. So the rise of the Mu'tazilites, and just before the rise of the Mu'tazilites, what did Imam Abu Yusuf do? He appointed Hanafi judges across the Muslim state. So when the Mu'tazilites gained power, everybody within the civil service was expected to conform with the Mu'tazilite creed, particularly centered around the creation of the Quran, which the Mu'tazilites believed. So if you wanted to keep your job, and you're already a Hanafi judge, or you're part of the state fabric, you had to conform with the Mu'tazilite beliefs. So that bred a huge level of animosity between the Ahlul Hadith, headed up by Imam Ahmad, and the then Hanafis, who are basically, you can say, hijacked by the Mu'tazilites. That might seem to be a controversial word, but it's a fact. The Iraqi Hanafis were hijacked by I'tizal. I'm not talking about the Central Asians. The Central Asians developed in relative isolation to, the Central Asian Hanafis developed in relative isolation to the what was going on in Iraq. And likewise, the Egyptian Hanafis also developed in relative isolation to what was going on in Iraq. But in Iraq, the Hanafis were pretty much compromised by I'tizal. And this led to a huge level of animosity between the Ahlul Hadith and the Hanafis. And obviously, people are human. Not everything would have been dealt with in just impartial manner. So within this whole discussion, there are aspersions cast on the credibility of Imam Abu Hanifa, the credibility of the Hanafi madhab in fiqh overall, the credibility of Hanafi works, etc., etc. And this animosity lingered on even after the Mihna of Imam Ahmad, even after the tribulation of Imam Ahmad. And it was never really resolved. So you can see the Hanafis why they doubled down, because of this animosity. They weren't brought along this journey of hadith by the Ahlul Hadith. Okay? You do find instances here and there within Hanafi history of certain Hanafi scholars adopting an opinion that goes against the Hanafi school in favor of hadith. Likewise in reverse, but to a lesser extent, non-Hanafis adopting Hanafi positions. That's never been an issue. But all of this, what I've discussed, is just to highlight that the question of whether we should go with fiqh or hadith, there's not really a right or wrong answer for it. It's just how things developed. And you can say possibly the correct response by the Hanafis, notwithstanding all things that were going on in the early 3rd century with regards to I'tizal and the animosity. The correct response of the Hanafis would have been simply to, okay, this is the tradition we've inherited. We don't really see a need to revisit our school based in light of all the new ahadith that have been gathered. We're happy to stick with the tradition of Abdullah bin Mas'ud and his students. Okay, if there's a clear-cut hadith that goes against our school, yes, we'll revisit it, and they have revisited it, like they revisited the positions of Abdullah bin Mas'ud in certain issues. But the mass adoption of hadith and taking every single hadith into consideration and to check whether the Hanafi madhab conforms with that hadith or not, that wasn't really the tradition of the Iraqi school, and that could have been a legitimate answer by later Hanafis that, okay, you have your hadith, but we're more interested in developing a body of fiqh that is a body of fiqh that is a coherent, cogent legal structure, as opposed to taking every single hadith into consideration that might have had a specific context that might not be universal. So this was this could have been a legitimate answer given by the Hanafis, but I think the later Hanafi madhab got caught up in between the two. So they tried to give answers to all the ahadith, and at the same time they tried to present themselves as defenders of hadith as well, in the manner that the Hanbalis and the Ahlul Hadith are. So we shouldn't.
Is the fiqh not based on hadith?
Yeah, a lot of fiqh is based on hadith. A lot of fiqh is based on hadith. And Abdullah bin Mas'ud and other Sahaba and other Tabi'un who settled in Iraq, they had a lot of hadith under their belt. They had a lot of hadith under their belt. And certainly at the top level, the famous ahadith would have most definitely been transferred from Madinah to Iraq, the famous ahadith. When we talk about the differences in fiqh between the Hijazis and the Iraqis, under the radar, lesser famous hadith, which are transmitted possibly by only one Sahabi or two, or ahadith which are not that frequent in terms of practice, in terms of occurrence, like, for example, just to give you an example, stuff to do with the eclipse, Salatul Khusuf or Kusuf, or stuff to do with specific transactions that don't really occur that often, or stuff to do with matters pertaining to specific issues of inheritance laws, specific details which don't occur that often, that are very rare. Those type of traditions might have stayed in Hijaz, would not have necessarily transferred to Iraq. I'm talking about those type of traditions. That is where you can have difference of opinion in the manner which I've described, that certain hadith didn't transfer. Okay, and sorry, just before that, and even within hadith corpus, you have chains of narrators or certain hadith which are musalsal, regionally musalsal, meaning musalsal bil Basriyin, musalsal bil Kufiyin, musalsal bil Shamiyin, musalsal bil Madaniyin, musalsal bil Makkiyin. What does that mean? All the chains of all the narrators from Bukhari up to the Prophet, they're all Makkan. All the chains of narrators between Bukhari and the Prophet, they're all from Medina. All the narrators are Kufan, or settled in Iraq. So those chains would have gone through Abdullah bin Mas'ud typically, or Ali. All the chains of narrators are all Shami. Those ahadith would not have been typically known outside of those regions. So even within the hadith corpus, and this is why Bukhari travels, so he gets the hadith of every single region. Even within the hadith corpus, famous narrators of hadith would not have been necessarily aware of other hadith which were transmitted within other regions. Okay? Before Bukhari and Imam Ahmad. Okay? Sorry, you were saying?
Sheikh, a simple answer that's given is, even this question, for example, fiqh versus hadith, is a problematic question because fiqh is the gist, the practical element of hadith. So hadith is a recorded incident.
Yeah.
And fiqh is the practice, meaning the expansion of the sunnah.
Yeah.
So the Malikis, for example, they didn't focus on hadith, they focused on Amal Ahl al-Madinah.
Yeah.
And similarly, the Hanafis, at-tawaruf al-amali, basically.
Yeah.
What was practiced in Kufa by the students of the Sahaba.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is that the question, the answer that's given is we're not even interested in an incident, a hadith. We're more interested in the practice, the sunnah, the Ahlul Sunnah, not Ahlul Hadith. So if we approach that angle, then we don't even have to go and in that discussion that, oh, they didn't take the hadith X, Y, Z. It could be argued that they knew the hadith.
Yeah. Yeah, that's most of the case. You can say most of the time the scholars of Iraq would have been aware of this hadith. It's a very hard assertion to make that Iraqi scholars were unaware of the hadith. For that you need some credible evidence. If it's an obscure hadith, then maybe you can say, but it's a very famous hadith. La nikaha illa biwali. Do you think Imam Hanifa was unaware of this hadith? I think he was aware of the hadith. It's in his musnad, I think. It's in his musnad. You can't. There's no marriage without wali. So a woman who wants to get married must have the wali. The Hanafi position is against this, and they reinterpret the hadith. But to say that Imam Hanifa was unaware of this hadith, that's why he went against it. Especially that it's a famous hadith. It's a huge claim to make.
But Sheikh,
So you need evidence to say.
Sheikh, even if he was unaware,
Yeah.
but he was aware of the sunnah, that's what they will say. Even if you can prove he didn't know this individual hadith, he knew the practice, i.e. the sunnah, the teachings, rather than because the science of hadith didn't exist at that time. That's the claim they make. I'm not saying.
Yeah. And even within fiqh, when you read the books of fiqh, sometimes it's hard to discern whether the imam was speaking on a theoretical level or on a practical level, responding to an event that happened in front of him. So you can develop your fiqh, your theoretical fiqh. Doesn't mean that is the opinion you're going to pass in practice. And sometimes it's very hard to discern when you're reading a book of fiqh whether this is the theoretical position of the imam or whether it's the practical fatwa that was issued by the imam.
They don't always put, this is my opinion, but it's discuss the issue. Leave it to you.
Well, when you're in a classroom situation and you're not in the field, so to speak. So, for example, issues pertaining to crops and crop sharing and tilling and the fiqh pertaining to crops and how transactions are to be conducted between the landowner and the farmer. There's certain transactions which Imam Abu Hanifa disallowed, but they were done on a widespread scale. Now, why did Imam Hanifa say this transaction is disallowed when these, like in Arabic you say muzara'a or musaqa or muhaqala, where there's an agreement between landowner and tiller, the person who works the land, that once the crop grows, I take 50% and the landowner keeps 50%. According to Abu Hanifa, this is an invalid form of transaction. Why would he say that when this transaction was well known and ongoing? It's a rhetorical question, but I have a theory that he was based in Kufa, and Kufa was not a land where, that immediate vicinity where crops were grown. It was a garrison town. Kufa was a garrison town. So, and obviously this position was disagreed by his students, Abu Yusuf and Muhammad. They allowed this type of transaction. But why did he disallow this type of transaction? Firstly, he's unaware that, probably unaware that this type of transaction is ongoing amongst farmers within the Levant. And secondly, he was simply doing taqleed of his teacher's teacher, Ibrahim al-Nakhai. And this might surprise some people, but this is explicitly mentioned by Shaykh Zahid al-Kawthari, and also is mentioned by the author of I'la al-Sunan. That the reason why Abu Hanifa took this position was not of any particular ijtihad, but rather he was simply doing taqleed of Ibrahim al-Nakhai, his teacher's teacher. So Abdullah bin Mas'ud's student was Alqama. Alqama's student was Ibrahim al-Nakhai, the major, foremost Iraqi jurist. And his student was Hammad, and Hammad ibn Abi Sulaiman, and his student was Abu Hanifa. So it's not as if the mujtahid imams were doing ijtihad all the time. Many a time they will simply take what the teachers said.
That's a golden chain, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the fiqh golden chain. Yeah, sorry.
Let's start Q&A maybe.
Yeah, yes.
So, but that's happening. And feel open, inshallah. If you feel like you want to ask a question, now's the time because we've got 15 minutes left. Tops.
Was Abu Hanifa weak in hadith? Sorry, weak on him? Where did this, A, is it true? And B, if it's not true, then where did it emanate from?
Was Imam Abu Hanifa weak in hadith? I call this the banana skin question. Now, Imam Abu Hanifa, there's a number of considerations here. Imam Abu Hanifa lived in a time and a place where hadith transmission was not the norm, was not the tradition. His tradition was a fiqh tradition. Okay, number one. Number two, his discussions of hadith when he was transmitting hadith was mostly in the, was never, was, well, I can't say never, but was rarely ever in the context of a majlis of tahdith. He never gave a hadith lesson in his life. Or there's no record of that. He gave lessons in fiqh. He never gave lessons in hadith. Now there's a difference, there's a point to this, because muhaddithun later on would have different majalis. They have the official majlis of hadith, where hadith can be transmitted. And if they committed an error in there, then their hadith will become problematic. And they would have other sittings of hadith, which were not official majalis, but you'd call them majalis al-mudhakara. Simply discussing a hadith with their equals. How does this hadith go? If they make an error in that hadith, it's not a big issue. They'll rectify when they give the hadith lesson, the official hadith lesson. So you have the majalis of tahdith and the majalis of mudhakara. Imam Hanifa never engaged in majalis of tahdith. He never gave official lessons in hadith. Yes, you have hadith chains going through him, and he offered hadith in the context of fiqh lessons. But hadith offered in the context of fiqh lessons, some would have carried those hadith onwards, but it wasn't an official majlis of hadith. Now, if it was an official majlis of hadith and he committed an error in that, then that would be counted against him. However, those were not official hadith, official sittings of hadith. Now, those hadith which he gave in the context of a fiqh lesson, they were carried over. If he committed an error in that, and a later muhaddith comes along and says, look, there's an error in this hadith which Imam Hanifa is responsible for. Okay, it's an error in hadith, but it's not, he never gave a majlis on hadith to begin with. That was never his intention. He never set himself out to be a muhaddith to begin with. Had he known that later muhaddithun would have scrutinized his ahadith in the manner which they did, maybe Imam Hanifa would have operated slightly differently when it came to absolute precision and caution when it comes to hadith. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20. So, but wallahu alam. Wallahu alam.
One of the questions that comes up, Shaykh, is that some people say that they don't want to follow any school of thought at all, rather give preference of following a scholar who quote unquote follows hadith. How would you say that this is a wrong assertion to make? Like, if someone's following, let's just say someone follows the Maliki school of thought, then fine, they're following a particular tradition, and that's okay. Because what we're finding nowadays is a lot of people, it's kind of used as if to, again, the lack of understanding of hadith and fiqh, formulation of the madhab and so on. So people assume it to be as if it's contradictory to hadith or outside of hadith. So in simple language, is following a madhab any better for a layman, or rather than for them to do their own tahqiq of hadith?
Well, a layman can never research hadith on his or her own initiative. I always say this, that if you want the purest form of leapfrogging fiqh and you want to go direct to hadith, then do this experiment. A person becomes a new Muslim. Now what do?
They'll be overwhelmed.
What are you going to tell them?
Follow a fiqh, madhab.
No. If the hadith-oriented people want to go down this route, that you have to follow hadith and bypass fiqh, what do you tell them? You can't.
Follow the Zahir madhab.
No, you can't. No. If you tell them anything, if you tell that new Muslim anything, even if you tell that new Muslim follow Bukhari and Muslim, then they're following you.
Yeah.
So you can't tell them anything. You have to let them figure everything out by themselves. Does that work?
In the practical ground there. It leaves them in confusion.
It never works. It doesn't even work. Even the Mujtahid Imams did taqleed sometimes, as I just mentioned. Even Imam Ahmad said Imam Ahmad. So Imam Shafi'i would differ to Imam Ahmad in terms of hadith, when it comes to hadith. Teach me hadith when he went to Iraq. But when it comes to fiqh, Imam Ahmad said, I differ if there's any issue in which there's confusion, or if I don't know any fatwa, I can't arrive at my conclusion, I'll automatically do taqleed of Imam Shafi. I'll automatically follow Imam Shafi. This is what Imam Ahmad said. You can say likewise Imam Malik, he did taqleed of the fuqaha sab'ah of Medina, the 7 jurists of Medina, and his own teachers. So his teachers were the fuqaha sab'ah of Medina. You cannot say a mujtahid imam 100% of the time did ijtihad all the time, never did taqleed. That's not how things develop. That's not how humans develop. That's not how subjects and disciplines develop. Now, if a person, any person, wants to follow a scholar who claims to follow hadith, that's fine. They're doing taqleed of that scholar.
But essentially, it's still taqleed.
It's still taqleed. It's still taqleed. Taqleed means your inability to do ijtihad. And ijtihad means your ability to argue for a position, or to derive a position from the Quran and Sunnah, or qiyas or whatever.
They will argue, Shaykh, it's not taqleed according to the istilahi that you follow a Shaykh with
No, he's following the Shaykh.
But he's following it with dalil. They will argue this.
But what's the dalil? The dalil is in Arabic.
Yeah, I know. But
The dalil is in Arabic. No, the dalil is in Arabic. If you're following a translation, you're doing taqleed of the translation. If a new Muslim converts to Islam and you tell him you have to follow Bukhari and Muslim, that person's following you in your position that you have to follow Bukhari and Muslim. They're not following Bukhari and Muslim. They're not following the hadith within Bukhari and Muslim. They're following you, and because you told him or her to follow Bukhari and Muslim.
And a lot of translations are by non-Muslims, so you actually find it non-Muslims.
Yeah, and there's many instances in the Quran where the translation is differed over based on the difference amongst the jurists, like the thalathat quru issue. Is it 3 periods of blood or 3 periods of purity? Yeah?
To answer that question, Shaykh,
So taqleed is fine, but just don't fool yourself that you're not doing taqleed, you're following hadith. Don't fool yourself. You are doing taqleed of X scholar. Yeah.
If someone follows this, the Shaykh, like, for example, the Imams, did they actually say this? And if they said this, then why did they go against so many Sahih hadith? It translates that when the hadith is Sahih, then that is by madhab.
Yeah. إذا صح الحديث فهو مذهبي. So the main consideration when it comes to hadith is authenticity. Okay? After that, you can build upon that hadith whatever you want to. But there are other considerations as well. So when a scholar like Imam Hanifa, Imam Shafi'i, they say إذا صح الحديث فهو مذهبي. When a hadith is authentic, then that is my madhab. They're just trying to spell out for you that the main consideration of hadith is authenticity. And if a hadith is authentic, then that is my position, that is my school. That doesn't mean they didn't believe that. They didn't believe in the other considerations that I highlighted earlier on, that it can't be abrogated. If a hadith is sahih but it's abrogated, according to the jurist. Or if the hadith is sahih but it's ambiguous, there's different interpretations that it's subject to. So إذا صح الحديث فهو مذهبي is not a universal statement in the sense that any authentic hadith is my madhab. It means simply that if it's authentic, meaning I haven't come across it, and if it's authentically established from the Prophet, plus all these other minor considerations that it can't be abrogated, it has to be clear cut, it can't be contradicted by another hadith, then yes, it's my madhab. This is just a generic statement they made to absolve themselves of the seemingly going against a hadith which they were not aware of. That's all.
Could it also be understood that that statement refers to, in my tahqiq and understanding, based on the hadith which I've got, this is my correct understanding? Not looking at disregarding the rest. Yani from what I've got in front of me, this is what is most authentic.
Yeah. So this is a statement that was given to their students. So Imam Hanifa or Imam Shafi'i would have said this to their students, that if there's a clear-cut hadith which I'm unaware of, and that hadith is proven to be authentic, then that is my position. That would have been my position as well. Okay? So like when Abu Yusuf, Imam Hanifa's student, showed up in Madinah when he was Chief Justice with Harun and Rashid as they were going for Hajj, and Sa', the specific volumetric measurement, the sa' of Iraq was slightly different from the sa' of Hijaz. So when he showed up in Medina, their sa' was slightly different. So Imam Abu Yusuf asked, is this really the size of the sa'? And I think the interaction was with Imam Malik, I believe. Imam Malik called the children of Medina and they all showed up with the same size sa', volumetric measure. So what did Imam Abu Yusuf say? Had my sahib, my companion, meaning Imam Abu Hanifa, had he been alive, had he been around to see this, he would have most definitely changed his position. And typically the sa' that was around in the time of Malik would have been transferred family to family back from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So this would have been a case of a clear-cut, even tangible proof of something that Imam Abu Hanifa, went against the tradition of the prophetic tradition. And Abu Yusuf is absolving his teacher Abu Hanifa of any responsibility of going against what seemed to be a contradiction of hadith. That he just went along with the sa' that was used predominantly in Iraq. He was unaware of the sa' size in Medina. And Abu Yusuf said, had he been around to see this, he would have most definitely adopted this view when it comes to the sa' size.
This incident, in terms of credibility, it raises a question in my mind that Imam Abu Hanifa is attributing that he performed dozens of Hajj. So in that visiting the Hijaz and so on, he never saw one sa' in all his years that he did the Hajj. Because he went to Mecca and Medina both.
It's funny when you don't go to look around for something that you'll miss it. So he went for Hajj. He didn't go to see whether they have the size or not.
But even if you didn't go for Hajj, it's not very difficult to find out from that location. Can you bring me one or?
But it's the sheer number of times that he visited. That's the question.
If someone wanted to find out, even if they had no Google, there were means of transferring something small from one location to another. Someone can say that, not necessarily me.
There's some worship, isn't it?
He definitely did have interactions with Malik and Ata ibn Abi Rabah in Mecca, the main mufti of Mecca. And he also stayed in Mecca for a bit after, towards the end of the Umayyad dynasty, and he came back to Iraq after when the Abbasids took over. But are there any records of Imam Abu Hanifa seriously studying with the Hijazi scholars? Interactions doesn't translate into serious study. You might have interactions here and there, but wallahu alam. What we know for sure is that the Iraqi tradition developed in relative isolation to the Hijazi tradition, and the Hijazi tradition developed in isolation from the Iraqi tradition. And as I mentioned earlier on, Imam Malik was completely averse to the tradition of Iraq, as were many other Hijazis like Sufyan ibn Uyayna. Sufyan ibn Uyayna absolutely was actually angry at certain Iraqi approaches to hadith and the deen in general. So yeah.
So Jazakallah khair for the talk.
Oh, yeah.
I have two questions. The first question is, as someone who identifies as a Hanafi, what should I do when I'm presented with a hadith that goes in contradiction with what I'm currently practicing? And by extension, the second question is, at what point can someone pick and choose between hadith? What level do they have to, or certification do they have to get up to pick and choose between a hadith?
If you are, as a Hanafi, and you see or you come across a hadith that seemingly goes against your madhab, there's different ways of looking at this. Not to overcomplicate it, but if that hadith is acted upon by other scholars, then it's fine. And you would essentially be doing taqlid of those other scholars. So this comes back to an issue of whether you as a muqallid can take from other schools or not. So the majority opinion is that you can. The minority opinion is you can't. You have to stick to the Hanafi school. Okay? So it's not a question of whether you're following hadith or not. But it's a question of taqleed, whether you can take from other scholars or not. That's one angle. The other angle is you want to follow the hadith directly. So regardless of who said it or not. So long as someone has said it, so long as a scholar has said it, but you want to follow the hadith directly, is that okay or not? So some Hanafi scholars have allowed this. Some Hanafi scholars like Maulana Zafar Ahmad Usmani in his Fatwa, he said, अगर किसी आमी to the in Urdu he said, अगर किसी आमी को बशहादत क़ल्ब ये बात साबित हो जाए कि जानिब हक़ इस हदीस पर है, तो इसमें कोई हरज नहीं है कि वो इस हदीस पर अमल करे. Something to that effect. So there's an acknowledgement even amongst the Hanafi scholars that you can follow hadith directly, but the caveat I would add is that you should make sure that at least there are other scholars from within the Hanafi school or outside the Hanafi school, they act upon it. So because if a hadith is completely abandoned, not acted upon by anybody, then that's dangerous, because there's a possibility there's an ijma' consensus against a hadith, or that hadith is abrogated. So do some investigation. What's the other question?
At what point can someone pick and choose?
At what point can someone pick and choose? In what sense? Out of taqleed or out of ijtihad? Because so if a person's a mujtahid or wants to do ijtihad, and they feel confident enough to do ijtihad, then they can go wherever the ijtihad takes them. Okay?
They possess the ability though to make ijtihad.
The ability to make ijtihad. And when we talk about ijtihad, it's not a single level of ijtihad. There's different levels of ijtihad and mujtahid. There's a high level of ijtihad of directly deducing from the Quran and Sunnah, which a lot of Sahaba and the senior Tabi'un did. Even by the time of Imam Hanifa, who was from the junior Tabi'un, he didn't do a lot of ijtihad directly from the Quran and Sunnah, because a lot of opinions were already in circulation. A lot of his ijtihad, a lot of Imam Hanifa's ijtihad, and likewise Imam Malik, likewise Imam Shafi'i, and definitely Imam Ahmad, a lot of their ijtihad was basically looking at existing opinions and checking which one's stronger. So if you're a mujtahid or if you're doing ijtihad, you can take whichever opinion ijtihad leads to. But even in that situation, taqleed is allowed, according to some scholars. Like Imam Ahmad did taqleed of Imam Shafi'i, Imam Abu Hanifa did taqleed of Ibrahim al-Nakhai and his teachers. Imam Malik would have done taqleed of his Medinan predecessors and seniors. As a muqallid, can you pick and choose? Again, this comes back to the question of taqleed, whether you can follow another madhab or not. So whatever your opinion on taqleed is, and you would act accordingly.
I think we've got time for one more question.
Yeah, maybe. So the last one, yeah. Regarding the if the hadith is sahih, maybe a possible answer can be that when the Aimma said when the hadith is sahih, the definition of sahih as we understand it currently didn't exist in their time.
Yeah.
So they're saying sahih according to my madhab. That's one thing. Another thing is the point you mentioned, Shaykh, regarding the majority and minority opinion of taqleed. How is it lost to so many people today who claim that there's ijma' on taqleed, right? Ijma' on wujub of taqleed of one madhab. And from there, another follow-up question is that ijma' didn't exist in the early generation of the imams. Yeah. The understanding of ijma' is even possible. But that will be in the cards and the drive-by.
Okay, yeah, just the issue of taqleed of one madhab, or can you take from different madhab? Like I said, the majority position is that taqleed of one madhab is not an obligation. Is not an obligation. A lot of people would be scared for saying that, but I'm not employed by anyone, so I'm not scared for saying that. Taqleed of a specific madhab is a minority position. Okay, it's a minority position. Now you can get into discussions as to what is taqleed of a specific madhab when it comes to your education in higher studies. Obviously, you should train upon one madhab. You shouldn't mix and match in the context of education. In the context of ifta and qada, there's another separate discussion of that. In the context of waqf, when certain businessmen would make a specific madrasa waqf on the people of a specific madrasa, so only the Hanafis can attend this seminary, only the Malikis can attend this seminary. That's another discussion as well. And then in our discussion, amal, practice. So this is our discussion specifically focused on amal, practice. Can you take from another madhab or not? So the majority position is that it's not an obligation. It's not an obligation. Now, if someone doesn't want to do that, that's fine. Someone wants to stick to madhab, that's fine. But the people who are the proponents of the stricter position should not condemn those who take the lenient position, because that is the majority position, whether they know it or not. It's the majority position. Okay?
Would you say it's a safer position, whether for a layman? Because they're going to make taqlid either way.
What do you mean by safer?
Safer in the sense that when it comes to, for some people individually, so they basically fatwa surf until they find something, and then they say, right, I'm making taqlid of this scholar.
That fatwa surfing is allowed.
That's the thing, isn't it? But then the underruling or the underlying sort of reason for the navigation of the fiqh was purely based on their desires, which we can't prove. This is a person by person judgment, but.
So so Ibn Hajar al-Haytami was fine with it. Ibn al-Humam was fine with it. What we now call picking and choosing or fatwa surfing. Obviously, it's not ideal, but what I would say is that this was never a consideration for the majority opinion, for the scholars of the majority opinion, that they never once thought about this, that this might go against ihtiyat, or safety or caution. Had this been a pressing concern, they would have highlighted it. Even the scholars, classically I'm talking about, who said following a madhab is an obligation and you can't exit the school, they didn't say because it might lead to fatwa surfing. They argued it from other considerations. So they said that the reason why you can't leave your school is because you believe your school is the rajih, the strongest school. So just like a mujtahid cannot adopt a weaker position, likewise you as a layman who are part of this school cannot take from a weaker school. So that's the juristic justification for sticking to one school. Now there is a minority of scholars who said that the reason why you have to stick to one school is because of precaution, because you don't fatwa surf, because you don't pick and choose. But that's an extreme minority position. Scholars who are of this position of precaution is Imam Maziri, and more lately in the subcontinent, Abdul Hayy Laknawi and Rashid Ahmad Gangohi. That is how these are the proponents of this position. But the majority of the minority position who said that you have to stick to your school didn't say ihtiyat. They said what I just mentioned, that the reason why you can't exit your school is because you believe your school to be the strongest school. You can't leave it for a weaker school.
Is it possible to reconcile between the classical position that you're saying is the majority, but later on the minority position becomes the majority through ijma'?
This over tea and biscuits.
Yeah.